from Renaissance-style chateaux, grand country estates, architectural glass masterpieces.
These are the remarkable homes
Simply breathtaking.
and magnificent landmarks
One day, my son, all this will be yours.
at the very heart of Britain's spectacular history.
I have never seen one like this.
Join me
I need to get there with all speed. Onwards, driver.
and a host of celebrities
Oh, crikey.
with a passion for the past
Kaboom! Wish me luck.
as we travel the length and breadth of the nation
It is between the walls.
and with unparalleled behind-the-scenes access.
From the highest heights
Now I'm through my blind panic.
to the deepest depths.
We'll uncover the secrets
Oh, my goodness.
still hidden within these breathtaking buildings.
These are the places that nobody else gets to see.
And explore the riches
How spectacular.
and treasures of one of our most loved institutions.
This is an amazing story. Come on, I want to know the end. I want to know the end.
Welcome to the secrets of the National Trust.
Today, I'm visiting a dark place in social history. The mere mention of which evokes fear in the collective memory of the British population and was immortalised by its most rigorous critic, Charles Dickens.
One of his most memorable creations, Oliver Twist, was an inmate of such an institution. This is the story of the Workhouse. Built in 1824, Southall in Nottinghamshire is the most complete example of these daunting monuments still in existence. Its architecture was influenced by prison design, and it's now a Grade II listed building.
The workhouse would have housed up to 158 men, women and children, all of whom would have come here to escape grinding poverty.
Coming up, I hear touching first-hand accounts from people who still lived a workhouse life as late as the 1970s.
As soon as I walk into this building or see this building, I just shiver.
Memories.
Memories.
I've also been given access to a place the poor feared more than anywhere, its unseen infirmary.
The feeling in here must have been horrendous with that mixture, not one of them helping the other.
The noise and smell, absolutely desperate.
And I suffer the staple food of the workhouse, my daily gruel. I'll be going behind the imposing facade to see how the workhouses shaped centuries of our social history. Helping me to unlock the secrets is Jenny Bond, who discovers the shocking story of a workhouse runaway.
That's a really unpleasant cell, isn't it?
Actor Nigel Havers is in Birmingham, uncovering the conditions for babies born into desperate poverty.
It'll be away from mice and other vermin.
Just ideal, isn't it, really?
And Angelica Bell is in London to visit a National Trust house that celebrates anarchy and unrest in more recent British history.
Oh my goodness. I was not expecting this.
Southall Workhouse is a dark presence on the Nottinghamshire landscape.
Walking up to the workhouse gate is incredibly eerie. You can almost feel the fear of the people who ended up here. And looking up at that building, you can see why. It's stark and intimidating.
I'm being introduced to this harsh world by the Trust's Sam Cousins.
Good morning.
Hi, Alan. Welcome to the Workhouse.
Thank you very much, I think.
Yes, indeed.
A gaunt architectural structure.
Very
isn't it, really?
imposing, very imposing.
I mean, imposing and stark.
It is.
What must people have felt when they were coming up this path, seeing that in front of them? The emotions going on in them, abject failure, destitution, the end of the world.
What the workhouse meant, what it symbolised, would have been absolutely terrifying. Families knowing that they were to be segregated when they got inside, and the women having to give away their children, essentially. the men, having to do hard labour. I think it would have been the absolute last resort.
The sense of failure that
Yeah,
you must have felt,
absolutely.
either as a man, a
Yeah.
breadwinner, or as a mother of children. You have failed. The only thing that's
I think
open to you now is this, and this is not comfortable.
It's not, and it had a real stigma then,
Yeah.
as it does now even. You were given workhouse clothing to wear, so you were easily identifiable. Your shoes were taken away. You were given clogs because you couldn't sell them. No one wanted to buy them, and they were very easily recognisable as workhouse garb, as it were. I think that lots of people walking up this pathway would have thought, actually, this is it for me, and this is where I'm going to stay, and this is where I'm going to die, so terrifying.
I'm rather reluctant to go inside, but go inside we must
Let's
to have a
do that.
look.
Workhouses were created as part of the new Poor Law in 1834, one of the most severe welfare programmes ever implemented. Set up as a deterrent to those who would claim poor relief, there were places of punishment with tyrannical regimes where the poor were criminalised. I'm met inside by the Trust's Jan Overfield Shaw to hear more of this living nightmare.
Oh, it's like coming into a prison yard.
Yeah.
This is Charles Dickens meets porridge, isn't it, really?
It really is.
What happened to them when they came in?
So they're segregated. Children separated from mothers, separated from fathers. And if you were good and you're well behaved, on a Sunday, you might get a chance of seeing your mum and dad.
You might.
You might.
Southall had several categories for the destitute, which saw them split into deserving and undeserving poor. And there were even multiple staircases built to prevent them from ever meeting each other.
So I come into the workhouse as a man. What happens to me?
Okay, you're an able-bodied man. You're put into your category in terms of the area of the workhouse that you mustn't move from.
What sort of
which is,
things?
You've got an able-bodied men's day room, and in that room, you may be asked to pick oakum. In the yard, you may be asked to crush stones. Pretty demeaning stuff. At one time, there was a thing called the crank, which was just a meaningless task.
What about the women who came in here?
They did a lot of the jobs within the workhouse, so the laundry, they did a lot of the scrubbing the floors, they did a lot of the cooking and preparing the vegetables. So they did a lot of work that was deemed women's work.
As their parents toiled, so too did the children, whose lives were no easier.
They must have been heartbroken if they were mothers, because they were separated from their children.
Yeah. You can imagine there's a child in the schoolroom over here, looking out, possibly, and mum's in the yard doing the washing, and they can't actually touch each other, communicate with each other. And it's true that young boys and girls learnt to read and write in here, which they wouldn't have done out there, that they did get better positions in service.
But
could
at
become
a
clerks,
price.
But at a price.
Of losing your parents.
Parents and your family and your connection.
This yard must have seen so many tears.
Yes.
Did many children try to escape?
Yes, children did try and run away, and they didn't get very far. Of course, if you escaped, even as a child, and you were in the uniform of the workhouse, you'd broken the law.
It's got everything but arrows on it to show you're virtually a convict.
Virtually, and then you would be punished when you came back.
The most arduous task for men was smashing stones in the yard, a gruelling and soul-crushing exercise. I'm being taken by Jan Overfield Shaw to the able-bodied day room to get hands-on experience of another futile workhouse task.
You've sat me in front of a pile of rope, so what am I meant to be doing with this?
So what you've got to do is to pick that rope and thread it and shred it with your fingers.
Pull it to pieces?
Pull it to pieces. You see the bucket down there?
With all these bits in?
Yeah, you've got to get it to that quality.
So what's this called?
So this is called oakum, and oakum picking. They used to buy it at £14 a tonne and sell it in that state for £23 a tonne.
So this is for caulking ship's decks then, presumably, for making them watertight?
That's
That's
right.
what oakum was for.
That's what oakum
I didn't
was for.
realise they had to make it from rope. I thought it
Yeah.
sort of came like that.
Ah, no. So prisons, institutions like the workhouse, they would get paid for this. Another way of making money out of people's penury, really.
One of the ironies of this job was that oakum-picking left-hands raw, rough and bleeding, in no state to take up jobs in the outside world.
What was the public's view of people who came into the workhouse and who were made to do work like this?
Well, being poor,
Yeah.
in poverty, is seen as a crime. It's seen as something you've done. You've created that situation for yourself. So you need to be cured, or you need to be brought back into being a good, upstanding member of the community who can go back to work. You're being punished for being poor, really.
Well, you are, because you've been given jobs which are by their nature uncomfortable and tedious. If you're breaking rock, you know it's a punishment. At least here you thought, well, you're creating something.
With over 150 inmates here at Southall, all doing this kind of unbearably monotonous work, keeping control was crucial. This was the job of the all-powerful master, there to enforce a strict set of rules imposed by the elected and unpaid guardians.
Oh, this is a bit smarter altogether.
You can feel that.
Where are we now?
This is the committee room, and this is where the Board of Guardians would meet.
And the person running it on a daily basis?
Is the master with the matron.
And how many staff?
Another 2 staff, so the schoolmistress, and then possibly a porter.
Not many then, really, for
Days,
150-odd folk.
Absolutely, and that's the idea of the design of the building. It's a panopticon. You can see from this central column all the way around the site.
Workhouse design reflected the Victorian attitude to the poor as undeserving of anything that would bring pleasure. There were to be no slackers, as from every point of the yard the inmates were under surveillance by the master of Southall.
Was there an opportunity for the master of a workhouse to impose his own personality?
Absolutely. He did have total power day to day.
And who was in charge here?
Well, here we have the Herrings.
Oh, gosh, look at her. Is that Mrs.?
That's matron Herring, yeah.
Gosh, face that could chop wood.
Absolutely.
So she looks fierce, he looks relatively benign. What's their reign like?
Incredibly efficient, please the Board of Guardians well. There's not many complaints from paupers.
The Herrings' tenure ran from 1855 to 1867, and they gained a reputation for being firm but fair.
They were still the enforcers, and if you did something wrong, you would be punished.
A small misdemeanour, you would lose your potato ration. For more severe things, you would be put in the solitary cell.
It's difficult to hear these harrowing tales of everyday punishment, especially when you think of the plight of the children confined within these walls and facing similar conditions. So no wonder that many at Southall made bids for freedom. Journalist Jenny Bond has journeyed to Suffolk to discover the graphic tale of a young and vulnerable workhouse runaway.
I'm in Lavenham, one of the most beautifully preserved medieval villages in Britain. It was built on the wealth of cloth merchants in the 15th and 16th centuries. But don't let the beauty of this place fool you. It's also home to a building that's both notorious and terrifying. Built in the 16th century, Lavenham's Guildhall of Corpus Christi was a Bridewell, also known as a house of correction, a place to punish paupers who'd committed petty crimes. I'm going to meet Josh Ward, who can give me the grisly details of what went on in this place. So I imagine that it was incredibly grim and incredibly crowded.
Yes, it was a mixture of males, females, adults, children, all together, all in the same rooms. Yeah, there are some unimaginably difficult punishments, some very hard labour indeed. I can show you a few examples upstairs. Some that can be quite upsetting though when you look at it.
Bridewells were intended to be a short, sharp shock, where the inmates would learn the benefit of work.
He could be brought here for very little. There's a chap over here who you might like to come and meet, by the name of William Ransom. As you can see there, I'm afraid for soon I'll be put to death. His crime? He stole some tobacco and some raisins from a warehouse in Lavenham.
So many of the people here then were what we would call minor offenders?
Yes, yeah, petty criminals, a lot of petty theft. And also for crimes, there's one fantastic one, being idle and disorderly. That would see you come to Bridewell.
harsh punishments were very much the order of the day. Curator Anna Forrest takes me outside to some of the cells where prisoners were brought whilst awaiting trial.
This was used by the parish of Lavenham to incarcerate petty criminals for very short periods of time until they were taken off to court and then ultimately either let off or put into prison in Bury St Edmunds.
That's a really unpleasant cell, isn't it?
It's not great,
really
is it?
Horrible. Even children were not exempt from imprisonment. Anna has unearthed the remarkable story of a young girl who first came to Lavenham Bridewell as a punishment in 1783.
She was in the workhouse in a neighbouring parish just down the road in Seamer, and aged 8 she escaped and ran away, and they caught up with her and brought her to Lavenham Bridewell where she was incarcerated for a short time. The third time she ran away, she was deemed to be an incorrigible rogue, and she was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia.
So what was that journey like for her, do you think?
They were hugely malnourished, and many of them had terrible injuries from the chains that had held them throughout the journey. And she survived the voyage, but a huge percentage of the convicts on that ship didn't make it. There are accounts of these convicts literally crawling up the beach when they arrived in Australia. She ultimately managed to make a bit of a go of it there, and she married another convict. Right. They bought a little farm, and they had a family.
Oh. Yeah. Well, I do hope that, you know, her relatives come back and see where she was and recognise the courage of that young Anne.
I'm at Southall Workhouse to discover a chillingly preserved and hidden part of Britain's social history. Set up as a last resort for the destitute, its harsh conditions were infamous and designed to encourage a stronger work ethic amongst the poor.
But most were here through no fault of their own, and they included pregnant women and deserted wives with their children.
These women would live on their own side of the house, segregated from the men and even their own children.
They took responsibility for laundry, for the back-breaking cleaning routine, and for cooking, which included the twice-daily preparation of truly monstrous, watery gruel.
And in what looks like my own Oliver Twist moment, Jan has been kind enough to let me prepare a bowl, with the aid of the original and secret recipe.
I found this Government of the Workhouse book, 3rd edition, and it's got a section on recipes, which I'm looking at here. What would they have eaten?
Mainly potatoes, bread, meat 3 times a week, but mostly gruel.
And what's gruel?
Well, it's porridge, but very, very watery porridge.
Let's see if there's batter pudding, cake, plain, gruel. 2 ounces of oatmeal, water. It's mainly water with a drop of milk in. So it's that very watery milk and oatmeal. How much oatmeal?
You want ½ an ounce.
½ an ounce of oatmeal? It's not going to really nourish anybody, is it?
That's probably about it.
You're just like Mrs. Herring, you are. So if I mix that in there, is that the idea? Oh, this is appalling. This is what we're expecting them to survive on. How much of this do they get? They get it heated up, I presume.
Yeah, breakfast, supper.
Like everything else in the workhouse, food and the lack of it became a form of punishment. It was even described in the rule book of one workhouse as needing to be as dull and boring as possible. And one rule I would have found very hard: no talking at mealtimes.
But this is so unreasonable. You're expecting grown men to break rock, to pull rope apart, to do heavy manual work on something like this which isn't going to give them any nutrition at all to speak of.
Not really, no.
Oh, for what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful.
No, the Master.
Amen.
Watery, tasteless meals and families split apart made the workhouse a last resort. But for those who could scrape a few pennies together, back-to-back houses were built across industrial Birmingham, providing cheap and basic accommodation. 3,000 were originally built, and these small homes were seen as a step up from the workhouse. but they couldn't have been further from luxury. To find out more, Nigel Havers has travelled to the last of these homes still in existence, saved as a capsule in time by the National Trust.
These back-to-back houses were a solution to house the poor who flocked to the city to find work. They were cheap to build and rent, but conditions were hard and got even worse. And by the 1960s, they were condemned as unfit for human habitation. Glassmaker Herbert Oldfield lived and worked here, and amazingly, it looks pretty much exactly the same as it did back in the 1870s.
Charles Baldwin, one of the volunteers here, knows a thing or two about what life was like for Herbert Oldfield, living in this tiny house, just one room deep, with his wife and 10 children.
So this room was what, the living room?
Yeah.
The kitchen?
Living room, kitchen,
study,
bathroom, study,
workroom.
Workroom, everything else. Herbert Oldfield came to this area in about 1860, and he came here with his wife and his children and lived in this house. And as you can see, when you look around, he lived pretty healthily, really. Yeah. I mean, you can see they've got fresh vegetables, eggs. They were even eating these things, which is quite surprising.
Oh, these are oyster.
Oysters was very cheap food, so it was the main form of protein for the working class people. You could buy bucket loads of those for pennies. Herbert would work from the desk over here.
What did he actually do?
Well, Herbert was a glass maker. He made glass eyes for the taxidermy industry. Yeah. And believe it or not, he got so good at making eyes for the taxidermy industry, he graduated on. And what do you think he was able to make?
I have no idea.
Well, we were going through the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of people were losing their eyes at factories and factory work.
False eyes?
So he made false eyes. You could come here and you could get yourself an eye fitted.
God, he was good, wasn't
All different colours, you can see. I think there's even one with a little bit of bloodshot in the corner of it. Birmingham was called the City of 1,000 Trades, and this is one of the 1,000 trades that Birmingham had.
Well, it was a step up from the workhouse, but up to 65 people would share 2 communal washhouses and just 3 toilets.
12 people lived in this house. You get some sort of perspective about how cramped it all was. Let's just hope they all got along together. Now, tell me, is this room pretty much as it was?
Well, yes, I mean, it is pretty much as it would have been in that time. So even to the extent that the wallpaper on the wall is authentic wallpaper to that period. Right. But actually, wallpaper did create a problem. Do you know what they were using for paste? They were using flour and water. And flour and water basically was food for bugs. Sometimes they said, you know, you could see the wall moving with the bugs in the wallpaper.
Not great for health.
No, not great for health.
It's like a dormitory.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I mean, this is the parents' bedroom. So Herbert and Anne, his wife, would have slept in this bed, and their 2 daughters would have slept in this bed here. And upstairs were the boys. But there is one person we haven't found a bed for yet, and that's baby Alfred. They had a baby while they was here. And there's no room for a cot.
No.
So where the baby slept was, believe it or not, in the drawer.
Perfect.
Well, I mean, it made a lot of sense because the baby was off the floor, so it would be away from drafts, it'd be away from mice and other vermin. And of course, it's fairly well confined as well.
In Herbert's time, the fire upstairs was only lit if someone was ill, but downstairs the flames would be heating the house all day. As in the workhouse at Southall, girls would have learnt household tasks to become maids in service if the opportunity arose.
So we need some fuel. Where is it kept?
We have to go down in the basement where the coal's kept, because the coal used to be delivered by the coal man. He'd tip the coal down into the basement below.
The public is not allowed down in the coal cellar, which looks pretty much as it would have done over 150 years ago.
In this house, because they had children, and some of the children were quite old, I think one of the older boys would have probably lit the fire.
There we go.
So that was a good bucketful.
Great.
Mind the heads as we go up.
Yeah.
The big fire downstairs was the main source of heat for the entire house, as well as a means of getting hot water, cooking, and heating Herbert's tools for his business.
If you're Herbert, you've got your day's work done.
Yeah.
You've had your evening meal. You're going to pull up a chair now. And you're going to enjoy the fire. Maybe have a cup of tea.
Oh,
that's special, isn't it?
That's lovely.
But even after a lifetime of hard work, there was no escape from the clutches of the workhouse. And once Herbert had retired, there was no welfare state to step in. and he ended his days in the workhouse infirmary.
Part of the workhouse story that's often overlooked is that of the infirmaries that stood next door to them. These were to house the paupers who didn't fit into the system.
And that meant being unable to work. At Southall, their infirmary, Firbeck House, still stands. Built in 1871, it was the most dreaded destination in the workhouse and has never been seen by the public. But the Trust's Sam Cousins is giving me exclusive access to explore this brutal place from our own history.
Gosh, this is gloomy in the extreme.
It really is. It really is. And the smell as well.
The smell and the noise would be overpowering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just one room after another. Astonishing, isn't it? So who would have come here?
Those who essentially couldn't work were put over here.
So you have a mixture in this one house here of pregnant mothers, mothers giving birth, people with disease, mentally ill people. Why weren't the mentally ill put in what were in those days called lunatic asylums?
Well, the sorry state of affairs was it was cheaper to put them here.
This must have been an absolute vision of hell if you've got all those kinds of people mixed together.
Absolutely, a real mishmash.
And that would have included the elderly too?
It would have done, yes, indeed.
So they would have been institutionalised over there and they'd come here to die, so their entire latter half of their life was in these rooms?
Absolutely. They may have been in the workhouse for some time as workers, and they would have come here when they become unable to work, yeah.
The feeling in here must have been horrendous with that mixture, not one of them helping the other.
Absolutely. The noise and smell.
Yeah, dreadful. And if you were giving birth here, desperate.
Absolutely desperate. But then if you were an unmarried mother coming to the workhouse, you were in a pretty desperate position.
It's terribly depressing, isn't it? It's like cells.
Yeah, it's pretty frightening, isn't it?
Yeah.
Conditions in both workhouse and infirmary were set to a nationwide standard, overseen by the guardians, but in reality, they were dependent on the goodwill and management of the man in charge, and by the time the infirmary was built, in the early 1870s, there'd been a change at the top at Southall, which would have devastating consequences.
So who was the master of the workhouse at this time?
It was Master George Shaw, who inherited the position from Master Herring after he died.
And how was George Shaw perceived?
Well, it wasn't a success. His tenure was seen as quite a catastrophe, actually.
What kind of things was he doing that weren't right?
He's seen to be a character who enjoys the local nightlife, shall we say, enjoyed the local pubs. There were allegations of inappropriate behaviour. There were knives seen where they shouldn't have been. There was allegations that the place was dirty, and being an infirmary, obviously, one of the really key elements of that is cleanliness.
So this is a period of disaster.
It really, really was, and it was such a shame after Herring's tenure that it kind of went into rack and ruin, but George Shaw was not liked.
So the consequences are what?
Master Shaw is dismissed.
So the history of this place, Firbeck, is not a happy one.
It is not.
But in the 1940s, radical changes were made to the welfare state. The dark days of the workhouse were seemingly over, with many of them becoming NHS hospitals. But the new welfare state didn't solve all of Britain's social problems, and by the late 20th century, one Tudor property with a long history of political turmoil had become a melting pot for the poor, the homeless, and a growing sense of anarchy. Angelica Bell has travelled to Sutton House to discover how the National Trust has preserved this snapshot of more recent social unrest.
Nestled in the streets of Hackney, this modern urban location is the setting for 500 years of agitators, revolutionaries and anti-establishment occupiers who left their mark on the building I'm about to see and the community around it.
I'm meeting Chris Cleave to find out more about the first in a long line of its rebellious inhabitants.
So Sutton House has a real unusual history. Tell us about the man who built it.
So it's a guy called Sir Ralph Sadler. He was an apprentice to Thomas Cromwell at a really young age. He rose to prominence in the court in his 20s, so he must have been a real high flyer, possibly through his connection with Thomas Cromwell.
Sir Ralph became a courtier of Henry VIII, his fortune in jeopardy when his mentor, Thomas Cromwell, lost favour.
in 1540 when Thomas Cromwell was arrested. So was Sir Ralph because of their connection.
Yeah.
But luckily, he was one of the few people who escaped the tower. And then even after Cromwell had been executed, he managed to stay in favour.
He seems to have crossed so many boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. He managed to get through 4 Tudor monarchs without losing his head, which, to be at that level of court, is quite a feat. So are you expecting the unexpected now?
I'm not sure what I'm expecting.
Jumping forward from Tudor times to the modern day, Chris has some striking evidence of Sutton House's previous inhabitants in what is a very unlikely National Trust preservation story.
Oh my goodness. I was not expecting this.
The house was suddenly empty in 1982 and the squatters got in. They lived in here for a few years. They would have used these rooms upstairs for their bedrooms, and then downstairs they had gigs in the courtyard and in the big room at the back. They were really political in the 1980s about changing society, and all of those slogans are really resonant to people today. This is one of the most popular rooms that we have in the house.
As graffiti goes, that's absolutely incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really iconic, and it's something that we're really proud of at Sutton House because it's a really important layer, the history of the house, and so we try and protect it as much as we protect all the other parts of the historic fabric. It was never intended to be something that lasted here for a really long time, so the way it's been created means that it's quite vulnerable.
So how do you go about preserving this?
We've got a special conservator coming in today, in fact.
I'm impressed that for the National Trust, this graffiti art from the 1980s is on par with the fine Tudor paintings from 450 years ago. The major challenge with looking after something like this, though, is the paint used is very soluble. So conservator Polly Westlake uses a sponge to absorb modern-day grime.
So we're trying to do the least amount that we have to just to keep it in its present condition.
So what do you mean, like basically, because there's like holes up here, you wouldn't say, right, we're going to patch those holes up. You just want to make sure everything is as it is and stays as it is.
The National Trust took the decision to keep things, not to do a lot of reintegration, not to restore and make it look perfect, but to keep it in this state.
It's great to see the stereotypes you might associate with an old property being replaced by something more inclusive, unexpected and radical by the National Trust. I wonder what the owners of the workhouse would have made of all this anarchy and rule breaking. I'm not sure the punks would have cared either way.
With punks running riot in Britain, Southall had also taken on a new lease of life in the 70s, becoming emergency social housing. But even then, the damaging stigma of the workhouse remained, dramatically affecting the lives of people who stayed there. I'm meeting 2 people who remember that era and have bravely agreed to tell their unique accounts of their very different experiences. Sue Swinton lived in this very room for 3 years after a family breakdown in 1971 made them homeless.
Now, tell me how big your family was and who were you here with?
I was here with my mum. I got an older sister, but my older sister spent a lot of time with a friend living in Newark. She couldn't cope with living here. But then I had 2 brothers who I used to have to look after. Because unfortunately, because of the circumstances of coming here, my mum turned alcoholic. So obviously it was like being mother to 2 brothers.
So you became mum, in effect?
Yes.
So we've got 5 beds ranged behind us here. Your mum, your elder sister when she was here, your 2 brothers and you, all ranged in a row?
Yeah, all in a row, yes. The only good thing about that was we tended to start at the end bed and jump all the way across the other beds and jump off the end. We was rather naughty for that, so yeah, we used it as a playroom. Everything was done in this room.
What was it like then, living in one room, small room, so many of you, with an alcoholic mum?
Very bad, very bad. I was sort of like stigmatised for that. No one ever came near us. It was the place, if you lived there, then you was kept well away from.
Lowest of the low.
Yeah, never ever anybody visited us here. It was very much like the Victorian times.
Sue, what does it feel like coming back here to the room that you lived in?
As soon as I walk into this building or see this building, I just shiver because of what happened here.
Memories, yeah.
Memories, very strong memories of the place.
Katrina Burrup was part of a very different family at Southall. Her father ran the part of the workhouse buildings that were used as a home for the elderly.
This was our dining room, so this is where we had our big family dinners, and our Christmas tree was in here, and yeah, it was lovely.
So it was a happy time for you?
Incredibly happy. No bad memories. It's a magical time living here.
Did you know then its history?
Yes, because there was still an awful lot of the history in the house. So there were still ledgers in the office. I was used to look for the names of children and try and imagine what they were like. When you see children coming in and then dying, and you just think they must have just had just nothing.
What about now, when you look back now?
It's hard now, because not only do I obviously know about the Victorian history of the building, but I'm now aware of the social history of the 60s, 70s, the people that were living in the bedsits at the other end of the building. I was living this wonderful life, and now I know that there were children my age living in cramped accommodation with a tiny little gated yard that they weren't allowed out, and they had to just look out on everything that I had. Yeah, it makes me feel awful.
We was allowed to go out of the door. Just down the passageway there is a green door, and if we went through there, then we was in serious trouble, because that was the private part of the building. The only place we was allowed to go was into the courtyard. It was just a little small courtyard, and that was it.
Very much as it must have been
in the Victorian
times.
Yeah. It's like they're saying when you read in books and things, and say, oh, people used to be frightened of the workhouse. If they went in there, they never got out again. That's actually true. When you came in here, you never thought you would get out.
It's very easy, isn't it, when you're thinking of Dickensian Britain, to put the workhouse in that bit of history, and it's something divorced from us. Exactly. When, as you experienced it, in the late 60s and early 70s, which is not long ago at all, no. It didn't end with the Victorians, it carried on.
No, it carried on. There's a lot of hatred in me for the place. It'll always be there with me, never leave me, never.
When it began to dawn on you as a grown-up that it wasn't actually quite like that, it must have been a strange feeling.
Sorry. To have those special memories, you know, all my magical adventures here, that's my experience of the workhouse. And although I know that there is more to it, I still feel I'm entitled to my experience.
When I come in now, I can't imagine how we actually could have coped so long with it, you know, because I used to stand over at the window and I'd look out the window for hours just looking and wondering what was going to happen. You know, when was that person going to come down that road and just take us away from here? But it never happened.
Has this become therapeutic, putting this back together, kind of laying the ghost, as it were?
Very much so.
So when you come in here now, it must be a mixture of emotions.
It is, it
Terror,
is.
But gratitude that you're not living here anymore.
Very much so, very much so.
Well done, you, and thank you for sharing it.
That's a pleasure.
It's been a real eye-opener meeting Katrina and Sue, but their memories of this place had left me shocked and saddened that such recent history still meant suffering and despair within these walls. It was only 20 years ago that Southall was finally considered unsuitable for habitation and the last of its residents were moved. This closed the chapter on the workhouse system, and with that, we consigned the harsh and cruel Victorian attitudes toward the poor and disadvantaged to history.
In 1997, Southall Workhouse was passed to the National Trust to be preserved and to act as a stark reminder of a brutally unjust period in British history.